The night air has a way of carrying sounds, doesn't it? Whispers on the wind, creaks from an old house down the street, or something else entirely. Something you almost convinced yourself you imagined. Tonight, we're going to lean into those unsettling echoes. We're going to explore the quiet dread that can creep into your everyday life, the kind of fear that nests just beyond the edge of your vision, or perhaps right outside your window. So, find a comfortable spot, turn off the lights, and put your headphones on. Let the world outside fade away, because what we're about to share might just be happening closer than you think. Welcome back to Scareverse. The house next door had been empty for nearly a year, a dark eye on our otherwise perfectly kept suburban street. We lived in a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind where everyone knew each other, or at least waved. My name is Alex, and I was 28 at the time, living with my wife, Sarah, in the house I grew up in. It was a comfortable life, predictable, until the new people moved in. A U-Haul arrived late one Tuesday, not during the day like normal folks, but around dusk. They worked quickly, efficiently, and in near silence. No loud music, no shouting instructions, just the dull thud of boxes being unloaded, already setting them apart from any other move I'd witnessed. For the first few weeks, we barely saw them. Their blinds were always drawn, even during the day. Their car, an older, nondescript sedan, was always parked in the garage, door shut tight. Sarah thought it was strange, but I figured maybe they were just private or worked odd hours. We left a welcome basket on their porch, a neighborhood tradition, but it sat there for 2 days before it disappeared. No note, no thank you, which was a little rude, but again, I chalked it up to them being new and perhaps overwhelmed. The only sign of life was their garbage cans appearing on the curb on collection day, always meticulously sorted and sealed. Then the digging started. It was always late, past midnight, sometimes stretching into the early hours of the morning. I'm a light sleeper, and our bedroom window faced directly onto their backyard. At first, I thought it was just raccoons, maybe a stray dog tearing up their lawn. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A dull thud, then a scrape, then another thud. It sounded like a shovel hitting dirt, over and over. I'd wake Sarah up sometimes, whispering about it, but she'd just mumble about my overactive imagination and roll over. It wasn't loud enough to bother anyone else on the street, just me, with my window open for the cool night air. A few weeks after the digging began, a smell started to drift over. It wasn't constant, but it would hit you, especially on warmer nights. A faint, cloying sweetness, like something had gone bad, but not rotten in a typical garbage way. More like decaying flowers or maybe overly ripe fruit left out too long, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. It was subtle at first, easily dismissed as something from the compost bin or a dead animal somewhere in the neighborhood. But it persisted, always strongest when I heard the faint sounds of digging from next door. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination making connections. One night, around 2 a.m., I couldn't sleep. The digging was particularly persistent. I crept out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and went to our guest room window, which gave a clearer view of their backyard. The yard was dark, but a faint, almost sickly yellow light spilled from a partially open garage door. I could just make out a figure, a man, moving slowly near a patch of disturbed earth in the far corner of their yard. He wasn't using a regular shovel. It looked smaller, almost like a trowel, but with a longer handle. He seemed to be placing something into the ground, covering it up with meticulous care. Then he'd stand there, still for a long moment, before repeating the process a few feet away. I watched him for what felt like an hour, my heart thudding. He moved like a shadow, never making a sound beyond the soft scrape of his tool. Then he stopped. He stood perfectly still, facing away from me, towards the back of his house. I thought maybe he was done, but then, slowly, he turned his head. Not his body, just his head, until he was looking directly at my window. Even from that distance, in the dim light, I could feel his gaze. It wasn't angry or curious. It was utterly, terrifyingly blank. No expression, just two dark spots where his eyes should be. I froze, not daring to breathe, convinced he couldn't possibly see me in the dark house. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity, just stared at my window. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to become invisible. After a minute that stretched into forever, he finally turned his head away, finishing his eerie rotation back to the yard. He picked up his tools, walked to the garage, and pulled the door shut, plunging the backyard back into complete darkness. I stood there, trembling, for another 5 minutes before I dared to move. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I told Sarah everything, but she just said it sounded like I'd imagined most of it in the dark. She was always so rational. A few days later, a flyer appeared on our community board at the park. Missing cat. Whiskers. A fluffy orange tabby. Last seen near the edge of our cul-de-sac. It was Mrs. Henderson's cat, 2 houses down. Whiskers was an indoor-outdoor cat, a friendly old thing, and this wasn't like him to wander far. Sarah thought it was sad, but unremarkable. But my stomach twisted. The digging, the smell, the man's blank stare, the meticulous way he buried whatever it was in his yard. Mrs. Henderson was heartbroken, posting more flyers every day, offering a reward. I knew it sounded crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the cat hadn't just wandered off. I never saw the man digging again. The smell eventually faded, or maybe I just got used to it. The house next door remains the same, silent, blinds drawn, car in the garage. They still put their garbage out, always neatly. Sarah thinks I need more sleep, that I let my imagination get the better of me. But sometimes, when I'm out in our yard, especially near the fence line, I catch a faint echo of that cloying scent, and a shiver runs down my spine. The disturbed patch of earth in their backyard is now covered with a strange, dark, unfamiliar shrub, planted just a few weeks after Whiskers disappeared. It grows remarkably fast, its leaves an almost unnatural deep green. Every time I walk past their house, I can't help but glance at that shrub. Stands out a little too perfect, a little too robust. And I wonder what else is buried under there. What else has gone missing from our quiet street that I haven't noticed yet? The fear isn't of what they might do, but of what they've already done, quietly, efficiently, right next door. And the worst part is they're still there, living their perfectly silent lives. And I'm still here, listening to the quiet of the night, always half expecting to hear the soft scrape of a shovel again. It's easy to dismiss a strange sound, to tell yourself it's just the house settling, or an animal outside. But what if the sound isn't the problem? What if it's what comes after the sound, or what the sound leads to? What if it's something you can't unhear or unsmell? The first thing I noticed about the house next door, after the new owners moved in, was the smell. Not right away, of course. It started subtle, a faint, almost metallic tang on humid evenings, easily dismissed as something from the sewer, or maybe a dead animal way out in the woods behind our property line. I was 28 at the time, living alone in the quiet suburban house my parents had left me. My life was pretty ordinary. I worked from home in IT, mostly kept to myself, and enjoyed the peace and predictability of our street. The previous neighbors had been an elderly couple, barely seen or heard. These new folks, I only ever saw one person, a man, usually in the early morning, driving a beat-up sedan. He never waved, never made eye contact. Just went about his business, which I initially respected. Everyone deserves their privacy. But that smell, it started to intensify. It graduated from a metallic tang to something heavier, sickly sweet and thick, like overripe garbage mixed with something distinctly unpleasant, something organic. It was worse when the wind blew a certain way, usually from their side of the yard towards mine. I'd be out watering my garden, or just sitting on the porch with a book, and it would hit me, a wave of nausea-inducing stench that would send me back inside. I tried to pinpoint it, walking along our shared fence line, looking for anything obvious. A leaking septic tank, a forgotten compost pile, maybe a dying bush. Nothing. Their yard was overgrown, yes, but not in a way that screamed source of this horrific odor. It just looked neglected, like the house itself. Their house was always dark, not just at night, but during the day too. Every single curtain was drawn, every blind pulled tight. It gave the place a sort of permanent gloom, even under the brightest sun. I never saw anyone go in or out besides the man in the sedan, and even he seemed to materialize and vanish rather than actually use the front door. I started to wonder if he even lived there, or if he was just dropping things off, or picking things up. My imagination naturally started to run a little wild. Was it a hoarder house? Were there a dozen stray cats living inside, slowly decaying? It felt like something out of a bad movie, the house on the block that everyone whispers about. But this was my block, and it was happening right next door. Then came the flies, swarms of them, buzzing around the sides of their house, especially near the back, where the smell was strongest. Big, fat, iridescent green and black flies that feasted on whatever source was creating the putrid aroma. I tried to ignore them, to spray my own windows and doors more often, but it was like battling an invisible enemy. They'd find their way in, buzzing lazily against my lamps, reminding me of the horror just beyond my wall. It wasn't just my imagination anymore. The smell was real, the flies were real, and something was definitely wrong. I considered calling code enforcement, but what would I even say? My neighbor's house smells bad and has too many flies felt trivial, almost petty, especially given I still hadn't actually spoken to them. One afternoon, while I was taking out the trash, I saw something. The man's sedan was gone, and for a split second, as I walked past their house, a gap in one of the downstairs curtains revealed a sliver of the interior. It was just a fleeting glance, maybe a second, but what I saw stuck with me. The room was incredibly dim, even with the curtains slightly ajar, and the air inside seemed thick, almost visibly heavy. There was furniture, yes, but it was draped in what looked like white sheets, like a house being prepared for a long absence. But what truly caught my attention was a dark, irregular stain on the floor, stretching across the bare wood. It was large and almost black, and it looked wet, reflecting the minimal light. My stomach lurched. It wasn't just neglect. This felt deliberate. That night, the smell was overwhelming. It seeped into my house, even with all my windows closed and the AC running. Couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I got up to get a glass of water, and as I walked past my living room window, I glanced outside. The moon was full, casting long, eerie shadows across the street. And there it was. In one of the upstairs windows of the house next door, a curtain was slightly parted, just enough to reveal a face. It was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and it was watching my house. The eyes were dark, unblinking, and sunken. It wasn't the man I'd seen driving the sedan. This face was older, gaunt, its features sharp and unnatural. It just stared, completely still, and I felt a cold dread spread through me, like ice water in my veins. I froze, hidden by the darkness of my own living room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The face remained, unblinking, unmoving. It wasn't just a silhouette. There was detail, the sharp curve of a nose, the hollow of the cheekbones. It felt like it was looking directly at me, through the glass, through the walls, right into my very being. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline, I dropped to the floor, crawling to another room, away from the direct line of sight. I huddled in my bedroom, lights off, covers pulled tight, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. A curtain folded strangely, anything but what I knew I had seen. But the image was seared into my mind. The next morning, shaken but determined, I called the non-emergency police line. I explained the smell, the flies, the constant darkness, and then, hesitantly, the face at the window. They were surprisingly understanding. 2 officers arrived a few hours later, and I watched from my porch as they approached the house next door. They knocked, waited, knocked again. No answer. They tried the back door. Nothing. Eventually, after about 15 minutes, they returned to their car and spoke into their radio. A supervisor arrived shortly after, and they conferred. I heard snippets of their conversation. Welfare check, no response, strong odor. Then they started to force entry. The sound of splintering would echoed in the quiet street. What they found inside, or rather what they didn't find, was chilling. The house was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing but those white sheets draped over imaginary forms, and that dark, disturbing stain on the floorboards that I had glimpsed. The officers came back over, looking bewildered. They said the house had been completely cleared out probably weeks ago, and that the utilities had been disconnected. The smell, they concluded, was likely a large animal, maybe a possum or raccoon, that had gotten trapped in the walls or under the floorboards and died. But then they added, "It's a strange one. Usually you'd find something." They took my statement, said they'd keep an eye on the property, and left. They never mentioned the face at the window. I didn't press it. The house next door now stands vacant, still with its drawn curtains and neglected yard. The smell eventually dissipated, carried away by time and ventilation from the forced entry. The flies disappeared, but the image of that face, gaunt and staring, has never left me. I know what I saw, and if the house was empty, if no one lived there, if the utilities were cut off, whose face was it? Who was watching me from that upstairs window in a house that supposedly held nothing but the decaying remains of a small animal? I still live here, but the peace is gone. Every night, before I turn out the lights, I check my windows. And every now and then, I catch myself glancing at that upstairs window next door, half expecting to see those dark, empty eyes staring back. Sometimes, the strangest things happen in plain sight or just at the edge of it. A flicker, a shadow that doesn't quite fit. And when you look again, it's gone. But it leaves a lingering feeling, doesn't it? A cold spot in the air, a sense of being watched, even when you're utterly alone. The curtains in the house next door, the old Miller place, were always drawn tight, even in the middle of a sunny afternoon. That was the first thing I noticed when the new people moved in, about 2 weeks after Mrs. Miller had finally passed. I was 17 that summer, mostly spending my days working at the local grocery store and then trying to relax in my room, usually with my window open. Our houses were fairly close on that street, a typical suburban layout from the 70s, so you could hear things. Not that I heard much from them at first, which was unusual for new neighbors with kids, I figured. Just silence. A strange, heavy kind of quiet that seemed to press in on our otherwise friendly street. My room was on the second floor, facing directly towards their house. I had a clear view of their upstairs windows, the ones always shrouded. One evening, I was just finishing up some homework. The glow of my desk lamp, the only light in my room. It was probably around 10 o'clock. I glanced up, just habitually, toward their house. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker, a slight movement in the gap of the curtains in their top right window, the one directly across from mine. It was gone before I could properly focus, just a shadow or a trick of the light. I told myself it was probably just one of the kids, maybe peeking out at their new surroundings. Nothing to worry about, just a brief, unidentifiable shape. Over the next few days, it happened again. Not often, maybe once every other evening. Always brief, always indistinct. A shadow that seemed a little too still. A shape that lingered just a fraction of a second too long behind the dusty lace. I started to feel a subtle prickle on the back of my neck. A sense of being watched, even when I knew it was probably my imagination. I'd be reading or just staring blankly at my wall, and that feeling would just descend. It wasn't aggressive, not scary in a jump scare way, but more like a quiet, unsettling presence that subtly shifted the air in my room, making it feel less private than it used to be. One night I couldn't sleep. It was warm, even for summer, and the air was still and heavy. My window was wide open, and I was just lying there, listening to the crickets. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 2:37 a.m. I rolled onto my side, facing the window, and that's when I saw it. The curtains in their house, in that same top right window, were parted just a crack. Not a lot, but enough to see something darker than the night inside. It was perfectly still, not moving, just there. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was a solid, dark mass. My mind immediately went to one of the new neighbors, maybe unable to sleep too. I lay there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. The dark mass didn't move. It didn't seem to be looking around, or restless like someone who couldn't sleep. It was just pointed, directly at my window. A cold dread started to seep into my bones. I tried to convince myself it was just a furniture silhouette, a trick of the moonlight. But the shape was too defined, too organic. And the absolute stillness of it was what really got to me. No shift, no fidget, just a perfect, unwavering observation. My heart was pounding, a loud drum in the quiet room. I wanted to move, to pull my own curtains, but I couldn't. I was caught, transfixed by whatever was behind that window. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the dark shape began to rise. It wasn't a person standing up. It was more like something stretching, expanding upwards, until it filled more of the gap in the curtains. And as it rose, I could make out details, or the lack thereof. It was a face, but not a human face. Not quite. It was pale, almost luminous in the faint ambient light, and utterly blank. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin where a face should be. It was perfectly round, like a pale, distorted moon. And it was still staring. Or rather, existing in the direction of my window. My blood ran cold, and a primal fear gripped me. Felt ancient, wrong. I finally broke. With a gasp, I scrambled out of bed, fumbling for the cord to my blinds. They clattered down, blocking out the sight, but not the image burned into my mind. I stood there, leaning against the wall, shaking, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Couldn't have been a person. It was too smooth, too blank, too unnervingly still. And then a thought, even colder than the previous dread, settled over me. The Millers had lived in that house for over 50 years. Mrs. Miller had passed away in that house. I remembered my mom mentioning how she'd become bedridden in her final months, how she just laid there, day in and day out, staring out that very window. The memory of Mrs. Miller, frail and quiet, staring out, suddenly clicked into place with the image of the blank, pale face I had just witnessed. What if it wasn't a new neighbor at all? What if it was something that had always been there, a silent watcher, only now revealed with the absence of the old woman? I started to question everything. The drawn curtains, the heavy silence from the new residents. Had they actually moved in? Or was the house just empty, occupied by something else? The idea that no one was even living there, that something else was just watching, was far more terrifying than any human intruder could ever be. It was the absolute stillness of that house that really got to me. I never opened that window again, not for the rest of the summer, not ever while I lived in that house. I moved my bed to the opposite wall, And even then, I sometimes felt that prickle, that silent, unwavering attention from across the way. The curtains in the Miller house next door remained drawn. Always. I never saw anyone go in or out, not really. No moving vans, no cars, just the same heavy, unchanging quiet. To this day, years later, I still can't shake the image of that smooth, blank face existing in the darkness, and the chilling thought that it was never really about the people moving in, but about what was left behind, always watching from the house next door. It's unsettling how quickly things can change, how a familiar street or a quiet neighborhood can become a place of dread. One day, everything is normal. The next, a subtle shift, a detail out of place, and suddenly, the comfort is gone, replaced by a quiet, gnawing unease that just won't let go. The house next door, number 14, Evergreen Lane, had always been perfectly maintained. Manicured lawn, fresh paint, not a single leaf out of place. So when the grass started growing shaggy, then truly wild around mid-August, it was the first thing that really snagged my attention. My name is Alex, and I was 27 at the time, living in the quiet suburban home I'd grown up in. Our street was the kind where everyone knew each other, kids rode bikes freely, and stray cats were the biggest source of drama. Mrs. Gable, the lady who lived at 14, was a sweet, older woman who always had a kind word and an impeccable garden. She was a fixture, a comforting constant in the neighborhood. This sudden neglect, so out of character, felt less like an oversight and more like a sign. At first, I figured she was on an extended vacation. People did that sometimes, especially in the summer. But then the newspapers started piling up on the porch, and her mailbox became a swollen metal contraption, bursting with circulars and envelopes. No car in the driveway, which wasn't unusual since she mostly walked or took cabs. But the lack of any activity, any sign of life, began to feel heavy. My mom, always a bit of a neighborhood watch in her own right, mentioned it to me over dinner one night. She tried calling Mrs. Gable a few times, just to check in, but it always went straight to voicemail. No outgoing message, just the default carrier greeting. It was odd, a little unsettling, but still easy to brush off. Maybe she was visiting family out of state, an emergency trip. A week later, the front windows of number 14 started looking dusty. Not just a thin film, but a noticeable layer that seemed to dull the light filtering in. I remember looking at them one afternoon while watering our petunias, thinking how quickly a house can lose its warmth when it's empty. The curtains were still drawn open, just as Mrs. Gable always kept them during the day, but the interior seemed darker, swallowed by shadows even in bright sunlight. There was a weird stillness about the place. No birds landing on the feeders she usually kept filled. No hum of an air conditioner. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to return. Then came the night sounds. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a horror movie trailer. Just small, indistinct noises. A faint scraping, almost like something being dragged across a floor, late at night. I'd be trying to read in bed, and a sudden, soft thud would echo from next door. It was subtle enough that I'd always doubt myself, convinced it was just the house settling, or a branch hitting the roof. But these sounds were always from her side of the street, always after midnight. It made the silence in between them feel deeper, heavier. I started leaving my window slightly ajar, not even consciously, just to try and pinpoint where they were coming from, to rationalize them away. One morning, a Sunday, I was out getting the paper when I saw Mr. Henderson, from 2 houses down, walking over to number 14. He was a retired police officer, always sensible. I watched as he knocked, waited, then tried the doorknob. It was locked. He peered through the dusty windows, cupping his hands around his eyes, then shook his head and walked back to his house. I walked over to him. "Everything okay, Mr. Henderson?" I asked. He sighed. "No sign of her, Alex. been almost a month now. Called her nephew, but he lives across the country and hasn't heard from her either. He looked at the house with a frown. It's just strange. Not like Marjorie at all. That's when the police were finally called, a welfare check. We all stood around watching the patrol car pull up. Felt like a small-town drama, not real concern. The police went in. They were inside for a long time. Over an hour, maybe more. My mom and I stood on our porch, pretending to water plants, but really just straining to hear or see anything. When they finally came out, their faces were grim. They talked to Mr. Henderson for a bit, then drove away. No ambulance, no forensics van, just the patrol car. Mr. Henderson walked back over to us, his face pale. They didn't find her, he said, his voice low. But they found something else. He hesitated, looking at our house, then back at number 14. The place was spotless, like she just walked out, but her purse, her keys, her phone, all still there. And the back door was slightly ajar. Not broken, just open a crack. The house stayed empty after that. The police put crime scene tape up, then took it down a few days later when they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing missing. Mrs. Gable had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. The sounds at night continued, or maybe I was just more attuned to them now. The scraping, the thuds. I started noticing other things, too. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on one of the back window panes, like something had been pressed against it from the inside, smudging it slightly. It was so subtle, I only saw it when the light hit it just right, a greasy smudge. It made my stomach clench. It wasn't a handprint, not exactly. More like a cheek or a forehead, pressed hard against the glass. One night I was restless. I got up for a glass of water, and as I walked past our living room window, which faces Mrs. Gable's house, I glanced out. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows. Her house was a dark silhouette, but the back window, the one with the smudge, seemed to catch a sliver of distant light. And for a split second I saw it. A faint reflection, not of the trees or the sky, but something inside. It looked like a face, pressed against the glass, just like the smudge suggested. It was distorted by the glass, flattened, but the shape of eyes, a nose, a mouth. I froze, my heart hammering. It wasn't Mrs. Gable. It was younger with dark, hollow eyes, and it was smiling. A wide, silent, terrifying smile. I blinked, and it was gone. Just the dark, empty window reflecting nothing but the night. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. A trick of the light, my imagination, the lingering stress of Mrs. Gable's disappearance. But the image was burned into my mind. The hollow eyes, the chilling smile. It wasn't a reflection of anything outside. It was something from within the house, looking out. I stood there for a long time watching the house, but saw nothing else. The scraping sounds continued for a few more nights, then stopped completely. The house still stands there, empty, overgrown, a constant reminder. Sometimes, late at night, I still look out my window, half expecting to see that face again, pressed against the glass, silently watching the street. These stories, they linger, don't they? Not because of jump scares or monsters, but because they tap into that primal fear of the unknown, of the familiar made terrifying. They remind us that sometimes, the most unsettling horrors aren't found in shadowed woods or ancient ruins, but right next door, or just beyond our own front door. They make us wonder what truly lies hidden beneath the surface of our quiet, everyday lives. If you want to hear more stories that stay with you, consider subscribing for a new one every week.